Hickeys on her neck. Who left these marks and what do they mean? James was sitting on the couch in the dark living room, listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock. It was past midnight, and his wife, Layna, still hadn't come home. She had told him hours ago that she would be late, spending the evening with a friend, but something in her voice had seemed off. This kind of situation was rare. Layna was usually punctual and always let him know her plans well in advance. But tonight, her words had come too quickly, as if she were trying to hide something. Suddenly, James heard the soft click of the door closing. He peeked around the corner and saw Layna standing by the hallway mirror, removing her coat. She looked flawless. Her makeup was still fresh, and her hair perfectly styled. It was obvious she hadn't just been lounging at a friend's house. "Hey," James said, stepping out of the living room. "You're home late tonight." Layna flinched slightly, as though she hadn't expected to see him. She quickly smiled, but her eyes avoided his gaze. "Sorry, I lost track of time at Sarah's," she said. "We got so caught up talking, I didn't even notice how late it was." "Really?" James sat on the armrest of the couch, crossing his arms. "What were you two talking about?" Layna hesitated for a moment, but quickly collected herself. "Oh, just a bit of everything. Work, summer plans. You know how we can chat for hours." James nodded, but his gut told him she was lying. As he stepped closer, something caught his eye that made him freeze. On Layna's neck, just above the collar of her blouse, was a faint reddish mark. He pretended not to notice, but inside, his mind was racing. "How's Sarah doing?" he asked casually. "She's good," Layna replied, unclasping a bracelet from her wrist. "She's been really busy lately, as always. You know how she is." "Interesting," James said. "Maybe you should invite her over sometime. It's been a while since I've seen her." Layna gave a nervous smile and nodded. "Sure, we could arrange that." James decided not to press her further. He knew that pushing too hard would only make her more cautious. Instead, he resolved to observe. The next morning, while Layna was still asleep, James sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, thinking over the situation. His eyes drifted to her bag, which she had left on a chair. He hesitated, an internal battle waging within him. He had never invaded her privacy before, but his doubts were too strong this time. Carefully, he opened her bag and began to sift through its contents. Among the usual items, cosmetics and keys, something caught his attention, a small box. Opening it, he found an elegant necklace. It didn't look like something Layna would buy for herself. He returned the box to its place, but now had even more questions. When Layna woke up, James acted as if nothing had happened. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, watching as she made herself a cup of coffee. "Good," she replied, avoiding his eyes. "And you?" "Fine," he said. "By the way, what's the necklace in your bag for?" Layna froze for a split second before smiling. "Oh, it's a gift for my mom. Her birthday's coming up." James nodded, but he knew she wasn't telling the truth. Her mother's birthday had been 3 months ago, and they had already celebrated it. Throughout the day, James couldn't shake the image of the mark on her neck and the necklace. He had plenty of suspicions, but wanted to be sure before jumping to conclusions. That evening, when Layna said she was going to see her friend again, James decided to act. He let her leave, but immediately got into his car and followed her. Keeping a safe distance, he trailed her through the city. Layna didn't go to Sarah's. She parked outside a small restaurant in the city center. James parked nearby and watched as she stepped out of her car and entered the building. A few minutes after Layna entered the restaurant, a man appeared. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and exuded confidence. Layna greeted him with a warm smile and an embrace. James felt a heavy weight drop in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. They sat at a table by the window, and James could see Layna laughing and touching the man's hand. He took a photo of them through the glass, then quickly drove home, not trusting himself to remain calm. That night, James barely slept. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and doubts. He wanted to know why this was happening and how long it had been going on. Most of all, he wanted to find out who the man was and what he meant to Layna. The next morning, James sat at the kitchen table with a cup of hot coffee, his thoughts drifting back to when he first met Layna. They had both been college students at the time. their lives filled with endless possibilities. James was studying computer science, while Layna majored in interior design. A mutual friend had introduced them, and they hit it off immediately. Layna had always been the person everyone turned to for advice or a heartfelt conversation. Her warm smile and genuine laughter made her the center of attention wherever she went. For a long time, they remained just friends. James admired her charisma but never dared to take things further. One evening, as they worked together on a project for a local charity, everything changed. They had stayed late at her apartment, laughing and sharing their dreams. When Layna accidentally brushed his hand, James felt a surge of emotion. In that moment, he realized he had been in love with her for a long time. A few weeks later, he mustered the courage to ask her out to dinner. Layna was surprised at first, but then smiled and said yes. Their relationship progressed naturally and effortlessly. They shared everything, joyful moments, small disappointments, and everything in between. To James, their connection felt perfect, as if they were two pieces of a puzzle that fit seamlessly together. The sound of a car engine pulled James out of his thoughts. He looked out the window and saw Layna stepping out of the car with Sarah, her friend she had supposedly visited the night before. Sarah looked calm and composed. Tall, with long chestnut hair and striking green eyes, Sarah exuded elegance and confidence. She had a melodic voice, a welcoming smile, and a knack for connecting with everyone. Her sense of humor was sharp yet charming. James felt a strange sense of relief. If Layna had indeed been with Sarah, perhaps everything he saw last night was just a misunderstanding. Maybe the man at the restaurant was an old friend or a client. After all, trust had always been a cornerstone of their relationship. "Hi, James," Sarah called out cheerfully as she entered the living room. "Layna told me you're working on some cool project. How's it going?" "Oh, it's going great, thanks," James replied, keeping his composure. "How was your evening yesterday?" "Oh, it was wonderful," Sarah said, settling onto the couch and pouring herself a glass of water. "We started with a funny movie, then decided to do our nails. And, of course, Layna insisted on ordering pizza, even though I'm on a diet. But who can resist pizza, right?" James nodded as she spoke. Layna sat next to her, occasionally chiming in with details. Sarah's storytelling was so natural and convincing that James felt a pang of guilt for his suspicions. "You know," Sarah added, turning to James, "you're so lucky. Layna is the best friend anyone could ask for. She's full of ideas and always knows how to brighten the mood." James smiled, but a lingering unease remained. He couldn't forget the mark on Layna's neck, her strange reaction to the mention of the necklace, and the man at the restaurant. Even now, Layna avoided his gaze, and it left him unsettled. "Sarah, you must be a master of persuasion," James joked, changing the subject. "Layna always says you have an incredible way with people." "Oh, it's my secret talent," Sarah laughed. "I could sell sand in the desert if I wanted to." They all laughed, and the tension eased slightly. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He decided not to mention what he had seen last night to either Sarah or Layna. He needed facts before making any accusations. After Sarah left, Layna went to the kitchen to unpack groceries. James approached her and wrapped his arms around her from behind. She tensed but quickly relaxed. "I'm glad you had a good time," he said, trying to sound casual. "Sarah really is a great friend." "Yes, she's the best," Layna replied, though her voice was slightly strained. James still couldn't get the image of the man at the restaurant out of his head. He wasn't sure if it had anything to do with his wife, but he needed answers. One thing was clear. He had to uncover the truth. The night was calm as James sat on the couch, trying to unwind after an emotionally draining day. Layna and Sarah were arranging blankets and pillows in front of the TV, preparing for a movie night. Despite their cheerful chatter, James couldn't shake the discomfort gnawing at him. He felt like an outsider, unable to stop replaying the events of the previous evening in his mind. Layna seemed unusually radiant, her smile brighter than ever, as though she were under some kind of spell. While James tried to convince himself that everything was fine, a nagging voice in his head told him otherwise. With enthusiasm, Layna turned to him and made a suggestion meant to lighten the mood. "James," Sarah and I thought, Why not make it a proper movie night to relax? Would you mind if she stayed over? She asked, her tone cheerful, clearly expecting him to agree. Caught off guard by the sudden proposal, James hesitated before forcing a casual reply. Sure, I'll grab some drinks and popcorn. It'll be fun. His voice was steady, but inside, he felt the tension rising. Sarah perked up immediately, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Oh, that sounds amazing. It's been ages since I've had an all-night movie binge, she said with a grin, glancing at Layna. The three of them settled on the couch, with Layna queuing up a few films on the TV. The evening started off lighthearted, with James trying to keep things normal. However, as the night wore on, he couldn't ignore Layna's behavior. She was constantly checking her phone, and every time he glanced over, he caught her quickly typing and smiling faintly at the screen. Those small, seemingly innocuous smiles only deepened his suspicion. Finally, he couldn't hold back anymore. Layna, who's keeping you so busy on your phone? He asked casually, masking his growing frustration. Layna glanced at him briefly before redirecting her attention to the screen. Oh, it's just a friend from work. We're planning to go to an exhibition, she replied nonchalantly, not even pausing her texting. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His doubts were growing stronger, and he knew he had to take action to understand what was going on. Without discussing it with Layna, he decided to test her reaction. He turned his attention to Sarah, his tone intentionally playful. Sarah, you know, your hair is incredible. So silky, like something straight out of a shampoo commercial, he said, leaning slightly closer. Sarah laughed, her eyes lighting up at the compliment. Oh, thank you, James. That's so sweet of you to say, she replied, clearly enjoying the attention. Layna didn't so much as glance their way. Her focus remained on the TV, and she simply laughed along with the movie playing on the screen. Her lack of response unsettled James. In the past, she would always show a hint of jealousy when he flirted, even jokingly. As the minutes ticked by, James felt increasingly isolated. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, he stood up. I think I'll head to bed, he said, waving casually. Good night, you two. Both women looked at him in mild surprise, but neither questioned him. Layna simply replied quickly, Good night, James. As the bedroom door closed behind him, James felt an overwhelming weight settle on his chest. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions. Why was Layna acting so indifferent? Why didn't she care about his obvious flirting with Sarah? Was it because she no longer loved him? Or was there something even worse hiding behind her smiles and apathy? He swallowed hard, trying to push down the bitter thoughts. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't silence the voice in his head telling him that he needed answers. Her texts, her smiles, her strange behavior, all of it pointed to something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. The next morning, James woke to soft sunlight filtering through the curtains. The house was unusually quiet. Layna, who was typically an early riser, was nowhere to be seen. Turning his head, he noticed Sarah still asleep on the couch in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, a faint smile on her lips. Swallowing his unease, James got up and quietly made his way to the kitchen. His heart felt heavy with anxiety as he brewed coffee, trying to steady himself despite the nagging sense that something was wrong. A few minutes later, Sarah stirred and walked into the kitchen, yawning and stretching. Despite her usual carefree demeanor, she looked a bit distracted. When she spotted James, she smiled, though there was a hint of curiosity in her expression. Oh, good morning. What's up? She asked, rubbing her eyes. Is Layna not home? James froze for a moment, caught off guard by the question. She's not, he replied, glancing toward the empty hallway. The pit in his stomach grew deeper as he realized Layna's absence wasn't part of the morning's routine. Whatever was going on, it was becoming increasingly clear that the answers he sought wouldn't be easy to find. James heard Sarah's question and immediately realized something odd. There had been no messages or updates from Layna, and that was strange. He looked at Sarah, suppressing his growing suspicion, and responded as calmly as he could. She hasn't come back yet, he said. Do you know where she might be? Sarah stretched and got up from the couch, adjusting her hair casually. "Maybe she went to the store," she replied with a lighthearted smile. "We stayed up watching movies all night and then crashed. Maybe she forgot to mention it." James glanced at the clock, then at the empty room. Something felt deeply off. Layna wasn't the type to just disappear without a word. He picked up his phone and dialed her number, the ringing echoing in his mind as he waited. When Layna finally answered, her voice sounded strange, uneasy and unlike her usual self. "Hi, James," she said, her tone tense. "I went to the store. I'll be home soon. Don't worry." A cold chill ran through James. Her voice lacked the confidence and warmth he was used to. Why hadn't she told him earlier? His suspicions only deepened, but he resisted the urge to question her further. "All right," he said evenly, masking his unease. "I'll be waiting." He ended the call and glanced back at Sarah, who was now seated at the kitchen table, looking relaxed as though nothing unusual had happened. James felt an urge to talk to her, even if it was an unplanned move. He needed to figure out what was going on. Sarah sat across from him, smiling, her demeanor intentionally light. James joined her, taking his cup of coffee in an attempt to calm his nerves. "You know, Sarah," he started, lowering his voice slightly to give it a more intimate tone, "you really are stunning. You look amazing this morning." Sarah laughed, her eyes sparkling as she absorbed the compliment. "Oh, thank you. That's so kind of you, James," she replied, her voice carrying a playful lilt. James noticed the atmosphere shifting. Her reaction was warm, and his heart began to race. What had started as an attempt to test the waters now felt like it was veering into dangerous territory. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked, keeping his tone casual but watching her closely. "With pleasure," Sarah replied, her grin widening as she raised her cup. They shared a drink, the silence between them stretching but charged with unspoken tension. James couldn't ignore the change in Sarah's demeanor. She leaned slightly closer, and before he could process what was happening, she kissed him. James was stunned. For a moment, he froze, caught in the surrealness of the act, but then quickly pulled away. "Sarah, I can't," he stammered, his voice firm but trembling. "You're wonderful, but I love Layna, and I'm waiting for her." Sarah's expression shifted to one of embarrassment, her face darkening with shame. "Oh, I'm so sorry, James. I shouldn't have done that," she said, averting her gaze. "That was completely out of line." The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. James decided not to dwell on it. The kiss had happened so fast, and he hadn't had time to think it through. But now, there were bigger concerns. Not long after, James got up and walked to the window, staring out as if searching for answers. Inside, he felt trapped, caught between Sarah's unexpected behavior and Layna's unexplained absence. A few hours later, Layna returned home. She acted as though nothing was out of the ordinary, launching into a cheerful conversation with Sarah almost immediately. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. As the day went on, James mentioned to Layna that he and Sarah had been surprised by her absence and even shared a drink or two while waiting. Layna seemed unfazed by the information. "Oh, really?" she said with a sly smile. "Maybe you two even kissed?" Her words hit James like a bolt of lightning, and he felt his face flush. His heart raced, but he managed to compose himself. "Well, not exactly," he said, forcing a laugh. "We just had a drink and talked. That's all." Layna laughed, but her laughter didn't bring him comfort. Instead, it unsettled him further. It felt as though she were testing him, toying with him in a way he couldn't quite understand. James sat silently, observing her, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every word, every gesture from Layna felt loaded with subtext. Despite his burning curiosity, he held back, unwilling to provoke an argument without concrete evidence. Something didn't add up. The lingering tension in the room, Sarah's kiss, Layna's indifferent attitude. It all pointed to something bigger, something hidden just beneath the surface. James resolved to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. James heard Sarah's question and immediately remembered that there had been no updates from Layna, which struck him as odd. He looked at her, suppressing his suspicion, and tried to keep calm. "She hasn't come back yet," James replied. "Do you know where she might be?" Sarah stretched and got up from the couch, casually fixing her hair. Maybe she went to the store, she said with a carefree smile. We watched movies all night and then fell asleep. Maybe she just forgot to mention it. James glanced at the clock and then at the empty room. Something felt off. Layna wasn't the type to just disappear without explanation. He reached for his phone and quickly dialed her number. When the call was finally answered, Layna's voice sounded different, nervous, and unusual. "Hi, James," she said, her tone tense. "I went to the store. I'll be home soon. Don't worry." A chill ran down James's spine. Why did her voice sound so unsure? Why hadn't she told him earlier? His suspicions deepened, but he chose not to press her with questions. "All right," he replied evenly, trying to mask his unease. "I'll be waiting." After ending the call, he looked back at Sarah, now sitting in the kitchen, stretching and appearing completely at ease, as if nothing unusual had happened. James decided to talk to her, though it felt impulsive. He wanted to understand what was really going on. Sarah sat across from him, smiling, her demeanor deliberately light. James joined her, gripping his coffee cup tightly as he tried to collect his thoughts. "You know, Sarah," he began, lowering his voice to make it sound more intimate, "you're truly stunning. You look amazing this morning." Sarah laughed, her eyes lighting up at the compliment. "Oh, thank you. That's so sweet of you," she replied, her tone playful. The atmosphere shifted. Her reaction was warm, and James's heart started to race. What had started as an attempt to feel things out was veering into dangerous territory. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked casually, watching her carefully. "With pleasure," Sarah responded, grinning and raising her cup. They shared a drink, the silence between them stretching but charged with unspoken tension. Sarah leaned slightly closer, and before James could process what was happening, she kissed him. James froze in shock. For a moment, he didn't react, but then he quickly pulled away. "Sarah, I can't," he stammered, his voice firm but shaking. "You're wonderful, but I love Layna, and I'm waiting for her." Sarah's expression shifted to one of embarrassment, her face darkening with shame. "Oh, I'm so sorry, James. I shouldn't have done that," she said, averting her gaze. That was completely out of line. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. James decided not to dwell on it. The kiss had happened so quickly, and he hadn't had time to process it. But there were bigger concerns now. Not long after, James walked to the window, staring out as though searching for answers. Inside, he felt trapped, caught between Sarah's unexpected behavior and Layna's unexplained absence. A few hours later, Layna returned home. She acted as if nothing unusual had happened, immediately starting a cheerful conversation with Sarah. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At one point, Sarah asked Layna what she had bought at the store. James watched Layna intently, unable to rid himself of the sense that something was off. Approaching her, he wrapped his arms around her in a familiar way, trying to feel close to her. But this time, it felt different. As he leaned in, he caught a foreign scent on her skin. A man's cologne, mixed with the sharp odor of cigarette smoke. It was strong, as if she'd spent time with someone who smoked heavily. James tensed, his heart pounding faster. "Layna, what's with these smells?" he asked, trying to hide his disappointment and distrust. Layna pulled back slightly, her eyes clouding momentarily as she tried to explain. "Oh, it's nothing. Probably just some lingering cologne from someone I bumped into. As for the smoke, I stepped outside to chat with a friend for a few minutes. Don't worry about it." James felt her explanation was so implausible that he could barely believe it, but he chose not to push her further. He realized it wasn't the right time to make an issue out of it. Still, the nagging feeling that something was amiss refused to leave him. Shortly after, Sarah said her goodbyes and left. James walked her to the door, but as she stepped outside, she suddenly turned back and kissed him again. The kiss was quick and unexpected. James was stunned, immediately pulling away, but Sarah didn't back off so easily. Layna stood in the doorway, watching the entire scene. Her expression was void of any emotion, just indifference. James couldn't fathom how this was happening. Sarah seemed unfazed, and Layna didn't appear upset either. Instead, she looked at them and slowly smiled. What's going on? Layna asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Is this another sign you two are planning something? James was taken aback by her calmness, which only heightened his concern. Layna, why is she acting so strangely? James asked, trying to make sense of it all. Layna shrugged, her gaze dull, her voice indifferent. She's just lonely, Layna said. It's nothing serious. I'm not jealous. It's fine. Despite her words, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. His suspicions grew stronger with every passing moment. After Sarah left, James remained in silence. Layna carried on as if nothing had happened, but he resolved to tread carefully. The subtle hints and strange coincidences gnawed at him. He decided to keep a closer eye on Layna. He wouldn't confront her outright, but he knew it was time to uncover the truth. He vowed to pay attention to every detail, every action. The next evening, everything seemed quiet, but for James, it was the calm before the storm. As he sat in the living room, trying to relax, he heard Layna take her phone and step out onto the balcony. He stayed put, not wanting to appear suspicious, but his ears were attuned to every sound. Peeking through the curtain, he saw Layna talking on her phone, unaware of his watchful eyes. Yes, I'll say it was just a friend. He doesn't suspect anything, she said quietly. Her voice was soft, but James could hear every word. He didn't know who she was talking to, but he felt this was a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. Layna finished her call and returned to the room, her face betraying no emotion. She had no idea her conversation had been overheard. From that moment, James knew he couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. Something was deeply wrong, and he was determined to uncover the truth. James listened to Layna's response and felt a deep unease settle over him. It's nothing serious, she said with a nonchalant shrug. I understand. It's just a kiss. You didn't do anything wrong. I trust you, and I trust Sarah. She just wanted to do it, that's all. James was stunned by her reaction. Her calmness was unnerving. She didn't show any emotion, no jealousy, no anger, not even irritation. It felt as though she already knew about it beforehand. Or worse, that she simply didn't care. How? How could she remain so indifferent? The next day, James began noticing changes in Layna. She started buying expensive cosmetics, new clothes, and even lingerie. Each morning, she spent more time in front of the mirror, carefully selecting her outfits and perfecting her look. She seemed to be changing her style, focusing on her appearance in ways that felt unnecessary and out of character. Layna had always been beautiful, but these changes felt excessive, unnatural even. James couldn't help but wonder if there was a deeper motive behind her transformation. When he asked her why she was spending so much on makeup and clothes, she gave a casual explanation. Oh, my parents have been giving me money for these things, she said. I just feel like I need a change, to feel better about myself. It's just a transitional phase, she added. I feel like I want to start fresh, maybe even reinvent myself. James wasn't convinced. Her explanation felt hollow, like a flimsy cover for something she didn't want to admit. Why this sudden, drastic shift? It was too suspicious to ignore. Feeling the need for clarity, James began observing her more closely. He didn't want to confront her outright or appear overly suspicious, so he acted discreetly. But his mind grew increasingly restless as he noticed more changes. Layna was altering her routines, acting as if she were trying to hide something. James's intuition told him something was wrong. He decided to continue watching, but he worried about the cost of pursuing the truth. Over the following weeks, Layna became more distant. Her behavior grew colder, and her interest in spending time with James diminished. She frequently found reasons to leave the house, business trips, outings with friends, or new hobbies. Whenever James suggested a quiet evening together, Layna would decline, citing other plans. She spent more time at work or with a different circle of friends, leaving James feeling increasingly isolated. The laughter that used to fill their home was gone. Layna's gaze was distant, and she spoke less about their future. One evening, when Layna said she was going to see a friend, James couldn't hold back any longer. He decided it was time to talk to her, even if he risked appearing suspicious or overly jealous. When Layna returned home, James approached her, trying to keep his tone calm. Layna, we need to talk. he said. I feel like you're pulling away from me. I just want to understand. What's going on? Are you spending time with other people? Other men? Maybe? Layna didn't seem shocked by his question. She simply raised an eyebrow and replied evenly. What do you mean, James? No, that's not it. I'm just going through a tough time right now. I want to change my life, become more confident, more successful. That's why I've been a bit distant. It has nothing to do with you. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as though she genuinely believed what she was saying. James felt conflicted. Her words left him with more questions than answers, but he didn't want to press her further and risk pushing her away. All right, he said, nodding. If you need time for yourself, I'll give you that. But please, if there's something I'm missing, just tell me. Layna didn't respond. Instead, she quickly left the room. James couldn't let it go. He felt that her distance wasn't as simple as she claimed, and he resolved to uncover the truth. The next evening, Layna dressed up in a way James had never seen before. She wore a dress she'd never worn in his presence, paired with striking makeup. Her style was elegant and confident, completely different from her usual understated appearance. Where are you going? James asked, his concern evident in his tone. I'm meeting a friend, James, Layna replied calmly. Just a little time to relax. You don't need to worry. Her voice was steady, but her calm demeanor only heightened James's anxiety. Her words didn't ring true, and her behavior didn't match what she'd been telling him before. James knew something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Layna's indifference and the drastic changes in her behavior felt like pieces of a puzzle he had yet to solve. Whatever was going on, he needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he found them. James decided that this time he wouldn't stay home, passively waiting for things to resolve themselves. Taking matters into his own hands, he rented a car, determined to follow Layna and confront his suspicions. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He followed her through the streets of the city, staying far enough behind to remain unnoticed, but close enough to track her every move. Layna eventually stopped at an upscale restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place she had never mentioned before, and certainly not one they frequented together. James parked his car a short distance away and waited, his heart pounding. A few minutes later, Layna stepped out of her car and disappeared inside the restaurant. Though James felt a pang of concern for her safety, his suspicion overrode his worry. He needed to understand what was happening in her life. The changes in her behavior had been too drastic, too abrupt. He stayed in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he tried to calm his racing thoughts. His mind was a battlefield of fear, anger, and heartbreak. Time dragged on. Layna didn't reappear, and James's imagination filled the void with torturous scenarios. When he finally saw her through the restaurant window, she was seated with a man he didn't recognize. They laughed together, their body language intimate in ways James couldn't dismiss. Her expressions, her mannerisms, all of it was unfamiliar, as though she were a different person entirely. It wasn't just friendly conversation. James could see that clearly. The man leaned closer, and Layna didn't pull away. Their gazes lingered, and their smiles spoke volumes. It was as if the life she once shared with James had been replaced by something new, something hidden. When Layna and the man moved to a private VIP room, James's heart sank further. The minutes he spent waiting in the car felt like hours, each second more agonizing than the last. He imagined their whispered conversations, their shared laughter, their stolen touches. James's phone buzzed, breaking him from his spiral of thoughts. Layna's name flashed on the screen, and he hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hi, James," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "I'm going to stay at a friend's place tonight. I just need some time to relax and talk." The words seemed innocent enough, but James picked up on the slight nervous edge in her tone. It only fueled his suspicions further. "All right," he said, forcing himself to sound neutral. But inside, his heart was shattering. He wasn't ready to confront her directly, yet the weight of her deception pressed heavily on him. Returning home, James paced the empty rooms, consumed by doubt and anger. Layna's excuses echoed in his mind, but none of them aligned with what he had witnessed. The distance between them felt insurmountable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that their life together had become a lie. The next day, Layna returned home, her demeanor as composed as ever. James sat on the couch, struggling to maintain his composure. "Hi," she said, walking past him without meeting his eyes. "Hi," he replied, his voice barely audible. The silence between them was deafening. James wrestled with the words he wanted to say, the questions that had been tormenting him. Finally, he found the courage to speak. "Layna," he began, his tone careful but firm. "What's going on? You're pulling away from me, spending so much time with other people. I feel like you're not being honest with me. Why won't you tell me the truth?" Layna froze, her eyes clouding over as she turned to face him. For a moment, she said nothing, as though searching for the right words. "You're right," she admitted at last, her voice cold and distant. "I am pulling away, but it's not because of you. I can't live like this anymore. I'm trying to find myself. I'm lost." James felt the weight of her words crush him. The woman he had loved and built a life with was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. Her tone, her demeanor, even her presence. They were all different now. "Is there anything left for us?" he asked, his voice trembling. Layna didn't answer. Instead, she looked away, her silence speaking louder than any words. James was left sitting there, wondering if their love had been real or if it had always been destined to unravel. James decided that this time he wouldn't sit idly at home, waiting for everything to resolve on its own. Taking responsibility for his suspicions, he rented a car and followed Layna, keeping a careful distance. He didn't know where she was going, but it felt crucial to find out. He drove through the city streets, trailing her car while staying far enough behind to avoid being noticed. Layna eventually stopped at an upscale restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place she didn't usually frequent. James parked nearby, staying in his car and watching. A few minutes later, Layna exited her vehicle and disappeared inside the restaurant. Despite his anxiety, James couldn't stop observing. He needed to understand what was truly going on in her life. Everything had felt different between them lately, as if they were strangers, and now her absence seemed far more suspicious. Was it just a phase of self-discovery, or was there something more behind these changes? James waited in the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to organize his thoughts. His heart raced, and his mind was a storm of conflict. Everything he was seeing pointed to one conclusion: betrayal. Through the window, he saw Layna seated with an unfamiliar man. They were laughing, speaking animatedly, and sharing a connection James hadn't seen between them in ages. Their behavior, their gazes, it all hinted at something deeper than friendship. When the two retreated to a private VIP room, James's heart sank. He stayed in his car, agonizing over whether to confront her or let things play out. He knew going further would uncover the truth, but he wasn't sure he could handle what he might find. The 2 hours James spent waiting felt like an eternity. He couldn't take his eyes off the restaurant, imagining their conversation, Layna's laughter, and the possibility of her in another man's embrace. Each second stretched endlessly, filling his mind with unbearable scenarios. Then Layna called him. "Hi, James," she said, her voice calm and casual. "I'm staying over at a friend's place tonight. I just need some time to relax and talk." The words sounded innocent enough, but James noticed a slight nervous edge in her tone. That, more than anything, confirmed his worst fears. "All right," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside, his heart felt like it was being torn apart. He wasn't ready for the explanations she might offer. He wasn't ready to face the possibility that everything they'd built together was a lie. Returning home, James couldn't find peace. Layna was supposedly at her friend's place, but he was left alone with unanswered questions and relentless doubts. The next day, unable to bear the tension any longer, James decided to visit Sarah. He hoped she might provide some clarity about where Layna had really been the previous night. Without saying a word to Layna, he dressed quietly, got in his car, and drove to Sarah's house. Standing at her doorstep with a bottle of wine and some groceries, James tried to appear casual, masking his true intentions. Sarah greeted him warmly, though there was a hint of guardedness in her eyes. "Hi, you decided to visit?" Sarah said with a wide smile, opening the door quickly. "Come on in. Want some wine?" James stepped inside, feeling a wave of mixed emotions. He felt uncomfortable but determined to uncover the truth. Sitting at the table, they started talking about mundane topics, work, future plans. But James's focus remained on the burning question that had brought him there. "Sarah," he began, his voice subdued, "I want to talk about Layna. Something's going on with her. She's different lately. You know her better than anyone. What's happening with her?" Sarah looked at him with mild surprise, then set her glass down and answered in a calm, reassuring tone. "Don't worry, James. It's completely normal. Women go through phases like this when they want to rediscover themselves. Layna's just at a point in her life where she's craving change. I'll tell you, she was at my place last night, and we had a wonderful time together." "A wonderful time?" James repeated, his voice faltering as he stared at Sarah, his suspicion growing. "What exactly did you do?" Seemingly unbothered by his tone, Sarah described how they'd spent the evening drinking wine, laughing, discussing trivial things, and even dancing. She spoke so casually, as though there was nothing unusual about their night. James felt his chest tighten with anxiety but kept his composure. "She seemed so happy, free, and relaxed," Sarah added. "She really needed that. She's changed, but it's nothing bad, trust me." James couldn't fully believe her, but what unsettled him more was how easily Sarah answered his questions. She didn't seem surprised or defensive, which only deepened his doubts. "Sarah, doesn't this seem strange to you?" he asked quietly, setting his wine glass on the table. "Last night, I saw Layna at a restaurant. She was sitting with a man I didn't recognize, laughing and talking like it wasn't just a friendly meeting." To his shock, Sarah smiled again. "Are you serious, James? That's not strange at all. She's just going on dates with other people. And remember, you and I kissed not long ago. No harm in that, right? It's all fine. You're just overthinking." James was floored. He sat there, unable to believe what he'd just heard. How could Sarah be so casual about what he'd described? How could she be so indifferent to what looked like clear betrayal? Just then, the door opened and Layna walked in. She entered with a smile but froze briefly when she saw James sitting with Sarah. Her expression shifted, growing colder as she stepped inside. "Oh, you two started without me?" Layna said, removing her coat. "Couldn't wait for me to join?" Sarah laughed. "No, we're just chatting. James is so worried. I'm just helping him out." Layna sat on the couch next to James, looking at him with mild curiosity, showing no sign of tension. She seemed as relaxed as ever, as if nothing had happened. The evening wore on, but James could no longer hide his disappointment. He drank wine, trying to numb his thoughts and forget everything he'd seen and heard. At first, he thought he understood the situation, but now he felt completely lost. By the end of the night, James was drunk. His body felt heavy, and his thoughts were clouded. He slumped onto the couch and fell asleep, leaving Layna and Sarah to continue their conversation. As he drifted off, the two women laughed and talked about his anxiety, seemingly oblivious to the pain their actions were causing him. Early in the morning, James woke to a slight movement beside him. He felt someone's arms wrapped around him, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Sarah sleeping peacefully next to him. She was so close that he could feel her warm breath on his skin. For a moment, James didn't understand what was happening. His mind was flooded with scattered memories of the previous night, but everything was hazy and unclear. Carefully, he moved Sarah's arm off himself, trying not to wake her. His thoughts raced with questions. How did this happen? Was this part of some game? What had he done last night? Everything felt confusing, and his heart raced with the tension of not knowing. He got up, walked to the kitchen, and grabbed a cup of coffee. As he sipped, he caught his reflection in the mirror on the wall. To his shock, there was a visible mark on his neck, kiss marks that couldn't have come from his wife. James examined himself closely, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of joke? Or was it a figment of his drunken imagination? Suddenly, he heard shouting from upstairs. Layna's voice carried clearly, filled with irritation. At first, the words were muffled, but then he heard her yell, "You have no right to judge me." James's heart leapt to his throat. What was going on? Steeling himself, He tried to calm his nerves and focus on what he needed to do. Find out the truth. Quietly, he climbed the stairs. His legs trembled slightly, but he was determined not to lose his resolve. At the top of the stairs, he approached the bedroom door and listened. Layna's voice grew louder, and now he could hear another voice, a man's. James carefully opened the door and was met with a scene that shook him to his core. Layna, her face flushed with anger, stood near the bed. In the bed beside her was a man James didn't recognize, still in his pajamas, looking disheveled as though he had just woken up. The sight hit James like a punch to the gut. His wife, his Layna, had betrayed him with a stranger, right in the house where he thought everything was safe. "What the hell is this, Layna?" James shouted, unable to hold back his emotions. "Are you out of your mind? How could you do this?" Layna turned to him, her expression shifting from a forced smile to tension. "James, you don't understand," she began, her voice defensive. "This isn't a big deal. I didn't do anything wrong. You kissed Sarah yourself." James felt his anger boil over. This wasn't just betrayal. It was utter disrespect. "Do you even realize what you've done? I saw you at the restaurant, laughing with that man. And now this?" he yelled, his voice trembling with fury and disgust. Layna looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and defiance. "So what? You kissed Sarah, and that was fine. We haven't been close for a long time, James. I have a right to find someone else." "You don't understand me," she said coldly. James, seething, stepped toward the man in the bed. Glaring at him, he ordered, "Get out, now, and don't come back." The man, clearly shocked and terrified, quickly got dressed and left without a word. He didn't try to argue or explain. He simply fled, looking more frightened than anything. Left alone with Layna in the room, James demanded, "What were you trying to do? Was this your plan all along? What did that man give you?" Layna backed away, trying to maintain her composure. "It was a mistake, James. I didn't mean for this to happen, but you pushed me away." "You don't understand anything," she said, her voice steady but defensive. But James didn't want to hear her excuses anymore. His emotions were overwhelming, and he felt like he couldn't hold himself together. Just then, noises came from another room as Sarah woke up. Hearing the commotion, she stepped out and approached them. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw Layna in the room and the disheveled bed behind her. "Layna!" Sarah exclaimed, looking at her friend in disbelief. "You brought another man into my house? How could you?" Layna froze, unable to respond. Sarah stood there, clearly disappointed and appalled, her shock no less than James's. Turning to James, Sarah's face was filled with confusion and concern. She seemed overwhelmed by the chaotic situation unfolding before her. With a bitter edge to her voice, she asked, "What even happened last night? I don't remember anything. But why do you have kiss marks on your neck with my lipstick?" James paused, trying to piece together what she was saying. His memories were scattered and unclear. He couldn't understand how he had ended up in bed with Sarah, or why so much of the night was missing from his mind. The pressure in his chest grew, and his heart pounded faster with every passing second. I don't know what happened, Sarah," he said, his voice faltering as he tried to suppress his panic. "I don't remember much of last night. I was drunk, but that's not what matters right now. I saw you, Layna, with that man. And you?" His voice broke as his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't finish the sentence. He looked at Layna, her face clouded with doubt and something else he couldn't place. Something inside him shattered. Layna shrugged, her face expressing indifference, but a sly smile still lingered on her lips. She seemed to understand that the situation was spiraling out of control, and perhaps even enjoyed it. "So what?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "You weren't exactly innocent either, James. You kissed Sarah, and now this is betrayal? I just don't get it. Why can't I do what I want?" James felt his blood boiling with furious despair. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a direct insult to his feelings. He stared intently at Layna, trying to understand if she ever had any respect for him. He felt all his efforts to save their marriage crumbling before his eyes. "Are you out of your mind?" His voice cracked with anger. "Do you really think this is okay? This isn't the same as what I did, Layna. You're betraying me, and now you're trying to justify it. Sarah stood to the side, watching the scene unfold. She tried to make sense of why James and Layna were acting this way and why their relationship had become so toxic. She decided to step in and try to calm them both. James, calm down. It's not like that. We wouldn't be where we are now if all of this hadn't happened. I see you're upset, but maybe you have your own reasons for being so worked up. And Layna, well, she's always been a little like this, but that doesn't give you the right to blame her for everything. James looked at Sarah with the feeling that she was siding with Layna. The pressure in his chest grew, making him increasingly aggressive. If this isn't betrayal, then what is it, Sarah? How can you justify what Layna is doing? How can you stand by her side when it's all so obvious? Sarah crossed her arms and looked at Layna. I'm not taking sides, James. But listen, if we want to resolve this, we need to accept that everyone makes mistakes. And you haven't been perfect either. The situation with Layna, it was a mistake, I know. Hearing this, Layna couldn't hold back a sarcastic laugh. Oh, you're all just wonderful. Look at yourself, James. You've changed. You used to be so serious, so righteous, but now you seem to have forgotten how to be honest. Everyone around me is doing the same thing, and now you're pointing fingers at me? James lost the last shred of patience. Enough, he shouted. Don't try to put all the blame on me, Layna. You're the one betraying me, and now you're trying to shame me for something I wouldn't even remember if it weren't for last night. Layna shrugged again, her voice calm but tinged with irritation. I just can't believe you're serious about this. You did the same thing I did, and now you want to accuse me? This isn't betrayal, it's your weakness. Sarah rolled her eyes wearily, trying to defuse the situation. She felt she couldn't tolerate the chaos any longer. Enough. We won't solve anything by yelling at each other. We've all made mistakes, but that doesn't mean we can't fix this. James stood silently, staring at Layna. His mind was tangled and filled with disappointment, and his feelings of pain and betrayal had no outlet. He felt his emotions tipping him off balance, plunging him further into despair. This makes no sense, he said quietly. I can't be with someone who doesn't respect me or my feelings. If we keep this up, we'll get nowhere. Sarah looked at James with understanding. She knew this was a tough moment for him, and that his decision would depend on whether he could forgive himself for what had happened. Layna, standing nearby, looked as though she couldn't care less about the conflict. She watched them both, contemplating how best to exit the situation without feeling much sympathy. This was no longer just a fight for a relationship. It was a test of whether anyone involved could remain together. As time went on, the situation grew more complicated. James and Sarah began spending more time together, finding solace in each other after Layna had become less important in their lives. They decided together that they no longer wanted to hide their feelings. Layna, on the other hand, remained distant, though she didn't completely leave their lives. She tried to maintain control of the situation, but increasingly felt like an outsider. In the end, James and Sarah chose not to rush into decisions, but a strong emotional bond had developed between them. Layna realized that her relationship with James was no longer what it once was, and that she needed to change her attitude toward life and those around her. All three of them came to understand that their situation was the result of many mistakes, and that each of them would have to make their own choices to move forward. Who was truly at fault in this story? Who betrayed whom first?